Elias Ramirez. My name is Elias Ramirez, and the weight of what I'm about to tell you could crush the soul of a man less anchored in the grace of Christ. I speak to you now from the stillness of my study, with an open Bible beside me, my heart beating with an urgency that hasn't left me a single day in the last 5 years, but before, my voice didn't resonate in places of peace like this. It resonated in concrete and neon caverns, in comedy clubs filled with smoke, alcohol, and the most addictive and dangerous sound in the world, human laughter, especially the laughter born of mockery, cynicism, and contempt for the sacred. The title of this testimony is not a strategy to grab your attention, not clickbait. It is the most sober, terrifying, and truthful declaration of my existence, a true testimony. I saw in hell the fate of those who make the world laugh but live without God. I repeat this so that the words may settle in your spirit with the gravity they deserve. I saw with my own spiritual eyes the place of torment reserved for those who, like me, use the gift of humor, the spark of comedy, not to ease man's burdens, but to add chains to his soul, to tickle it while his spiritual house burned. I was the king of that castle of ashes, on stages throughout Latin America and in television specials that some of you may remember. I was Elias, the Full One, a nickname I earned for my particular laugh after each joke, a high-pitched laugh, almost a shriek that pierced the audience. But the nickname was deeper. Like a full one, I fed on the carrion of other people's faith, tore apart the reputations of pastors, mocked those who prayed, mocked those who spoke in tongues, and ridiculed every pillar of the Christian faith until it was reduced to a pile of rubble for the delight of an audience thirsty for irreverence. And how they laughed! The laughter was a roar, a wave of sound that struck my chest and made me feel like a god. Every laugh was an affirmation. Every clap a dose of the drug my ego needed to survive. I believed I was on top of the world. I had money, recognition, and the ability to control the emotions of thousands with a simple turn of phrase. I believed I was intelligent, a free thinker, an iconoclast waking people from their religious opiate. How blind I was! It was I who slept soundly, lulled by the world's applause, while my soul silently slipped toward the precipice. I didn't understand that the laughter I provoked was, in many cases, the sound of souls drifting a little further from God, finding in my cynicism a justification for their own unbelief. Every joke about the Bible was another stone I placed in the path of someone who perhaps, just perhaps, was groping for the way to the cross. I ask you to listen to me with an open heart, even if what I say challenges everything you believe, because I was like you, perhaps, the skeptic in the front row, the one who crossed his arms when he heard a testimony, the one who thought, poor people, they need to believe in fairy tales to cope with life. I was the one who sat in the back row of life, throwing sarcastic tomatoes at anything that smelled sacred. That's why, when God broke me, He did it in a way that my arrogance couldn't deny. He didn't send me a kind preacher or a Bible tract. He took me to the place my jokes mocked. He showed me the terrible truth behind the comedy that doesn't glorify God. Before I plunge into the dark waters of my past and the terrifying night that changed my eternity, I want to ask you something. If you've gotten this far, if these opening words have already stirred something within you, an echo, a question, a discomfort, it's not by chance. The Holy Spirit is calling you to listen. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the days of glory and neon, to the nights of applause and profound loneliness, to the life of Elias Ramirez, the Full One. Let me describe the palace of vanity they built, so you can understand the horror I felt when I saw its foundations and its final destination, hell itself. Because to understand God's justice, you must first understand the depth of my sin. My stage wasn't just a wooden platform, it was an altar of blasphemy, and I was the high priest offering mock sacrifices to the prince of this world, and the payback, believe me, the payback was about to be collected. Please join me in that past, in the antechamber of my descent. My rise in the world of comedy wasn't an accident. It was a meticulously executed strategy, fueled by a childhood wound. I grew up in a home where silence was the norm, and approval, a scarce commodity. I discovered early on that wit and a sharp tongue could break that silence, and more importantly, gave me a sense of control. If I could make someone laugh, especially at the expense of something or someone, I felt powerful. Comedy became my armor and my weapon. I started in seedy bars, with microphones that smelled of stale beer, testing material. And I discovered the gold mine, or what I thought was gold: religion. Making fun of politicians was easy, everyone did it. Making fun of celebrities was temporary, but making fun of God, that was different. It struck a deep nerve in people. It generated a visceral reaction, a laugh that was part relief, part guilt, and 100% addictive. That's how Elias, the full one, was born. My public persona was an amalgamation of everything secular society applauds. I was cynical, materialistic. I proclaimed himself an intellectual superior to the credulous masses. Above all, he was ruthless. My most famous routine, the one that catapulted me to television specials, was called Noah's Ark. It's a fairy tale. In it, I spent 30 minutes demolishing the biblical story. I didn't do it with theological arguments, of course, but with sarcasm designed to make faith seem childish and stupid. Imagine Noah, I said, strutting across the stage, a 600-year-old man. Do you know what it's like to be 600 years old? Your knees creak like a murka at a carnival, and God asks him to build a ship the size of a mile. At that age, all you want to build is a good nap. The audience roared with laughter. I continued describing the animals coming aboard in a line, making jokes about the bad smell, about how the lions probably ate the sheep on the first day. My punchline was, the story of the ark isn't meant to teach us about faith. It's meant to teach us that if you hear voices at 600 years old, you don't need a boat, you need a good psychiatrist. That's what I was selling. The desacralization of the sacred. I turned miracles into anecdotes to ridicule. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes was a cheap magic trick. David versus Goliath was the story of a lucky kid and a giant having a bad day. And Jesus, I specialized in a particularly venomous humor toward the figure of Christ. I avoided direct blasphemy. It was more subtle, more perverse. I presented him as a hippie cult leader, a naive man with good intentions but little connection to reality. Love your enemy, I'd quote with a condescending smile. Sure, tell that to the guy who just stole your wallet. Let's see if he returns it with divine interest. Every laugh was a vote in favor of my worldview. A universe without God, without purpose, without hope, where the only possible redemption was a good burst of laughter to forget the emptiness, and the emptiness was real. Oh, believe me, it was an ocean. After the SS, after the standing ovations and the pats on the back, I returned to my 5-star hotel room. A deafening silence replaced the applause. I stood in front of the mirror, removing the character's makeup, and I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. I saw a successful imposter. I had everything the world says you should want: fame, tons of money, women who were attracted to the character, not the person. But inside, I was eaten away by a loneliness so deep that sometimes it was hard to breathe. I tried to fill it with everything money could buy: luxury cars, expensive watches, parties that lasted until dawn, but it was like trying to fill a black hole with confetti. Nothing was enough. The audience's laughter was my only medicine, and every last night I needed a stronger dose. Now I understand what the Word of God diagnoses with surgical precision in Jeremiah 179, the heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked, who can know it? My own heart deceived me. It told me I was happy, that I was free, that I was superior, but I was a slave to applause, a slave to my ego, a slave to the bitterness that had given rise to my humor. I was building my house on the sands of vanity, and although the facade was impressive, it had no foundation. I want to ask you a question, and I ask you to be brave and honest in your response in the comments, not for me to see, but as an exercise for your own soul. Have you ever used laughter, sarcasm, or cynicism as a wall so that no one sees your pain? Have you created a strong, funny, and irreverent persona so that the world doesn't discover your cracks, your loneliness, or your fear? I read your comments because I lived behind that mask for 20 years, and I know how heavy that disguise is. Your testimony, your simple truth, has happened to me. It might be encouraging for someone else reading this who feels exactly the same way. My success culminated in signing a contract for a special on a major streaming platform. The title was going to be Elias, the full one, without God or law. It was the pinnacle of my career, the coronation of my empire of irreverence. I traveled to Mexico City for a series of shows that would be recorded for that special. The theaters were packed, the energy electric. I was at my peak, sharper and more biting than ever. My jokes against faith were received with an almost religious fervor, an irony that completely eluded me back then. I felt invincible, untouchable, a titan of comedy, but the universe I had built with words and laughter had a crack, and one night, after the most successful show of my life, in the presidential suite of a hotel in the heart of the world's largest city, that cracks began to widen, the first tremor of a spiritual earthquake that would not only bring down my stage, but would collapse my entire reality. The presidential suite was the embodiment of my ego. It occupied the top corner of the hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a 180-degree view of the glittering monster that is Mexico City at night. Millions of lights twinkled like a tapestry of fallen diamonds. There was a bottle of expensive champagne in a silver bucket, and the echoes of the last applause still vibrated in my ears. I had just given the best show of my life. The audience had been in the palm of my hand. I had capped off the night with my cruelest joke about resurrection, and the ovation was so thunderous that I felt the ground shake. I was king of the world, or so I kept telling myself as I poured myself a drink, contemplating my kingdom of lights. That's when the first tremor occurred. It wasn't an earthquake, not on the ground, it was inside me, a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a cold that originated in the marrow of my bones and spread outward, making my skin prickle. I dismissed it, tiredness, adrenaline, the late dinner. I laughed, my own hearty laugh, alone in the room. Elias, you're getting old, I told myself. But the laugh sounded hollow, strange. The second tremor was a wave of pure panic, so irrational and overwhelming that I almost dropped my glass. It wasn't normal anxiety, it was existential dread. The primal feeling that something was terribly wrong with the fabric of reality. The city lights, which a second before had seemed like a trophy, suddenly felt like the eyes of a million silent witnesses to my impending doom. I tried to shake off the feeling. I paced the suite, touching the expensive furniture, the cold marble of the bar, as if to anchor myself in the material reality I loved so much. But reality itself seemed to be growing thin, fragile. I turned on the television to a news channel, searching for the mundane noise of the world, but the anchors' voices sounded distant and muffled. I began to hear another sound, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it grew, multiplied, becoming a murmur of thousands, perhaps millions of voices, and amidst those whispers, I discerned a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Laughter, not the joyful, explosive laughter of my audience, but mocking, cruel laughter, full of contempt. The very essence of mockery that I distilled in my shows. But now it wasn't directed at a distant god, it was directed at me. I put my hands to my ears, but the sound was inside my head. I fell to my knees on the designer carpet, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a prisoner trying to escape. An invisible pressure began to crush me. I felt the physical weight of every soul that had laughed with me, of every heart I had hardened with my words. It was an unbearable burden. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my throat produced no sound. I was paralyzed, a powerless spectator of my own disintegration. It was then that I looked toward the large window. The city had vanished. In its place was only swirling darkness, an absolute void, and in the reflection of the glass, I didn't see myself. I saw a skeletal, tormented figure, with eyes sunken in sockets of despair, mouth open in a silent scream. It was me, it was the real me, stripped of flesh and persona. And then, the worst sensation of all, a violent attraction, as if an invisible hook had sunk into my soul and was pulling me down. I felt a tearing, a nauseating separation. For an instant I saw my own body, the famous Elias Ramirez, slumped on the suite floor, a useless, gaudy husk of flesh, and my consciousness, my being, My true self was ripped from it. The room's luxury dissolved like a watercolor under a stream of water. The colors faded into a sickly gray and then into total blackness. I was falling, or rather being pulled down at a dizzying speed. The journey through this darkness was not silent, it was filled with whispers and mocking laughter, but now they were joined by cries of agony, wails so deep they spoke of endless suffering. I, the man who believed only in what I could touch and measure, was experiencing the undeniable. I was out of my body on a spiritual plane and was being taken to a place my intellect had always scoffed at. There were no angels or tunnels of light, only an implacable force and a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but an active and malevolent presence. Much later, when I learned to read God's word with a trembling heart, I found the phrase in Hebrews 10:31, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." I didn't understand God at that time, but I was experiencing the meaning of fearful thing. It was the pure terror of being stripped of all control, all defense, and being forcibly taken to face the direct consequences of a life of rebellion. The fall seemed to last an eternity. There was no up or down, only the descent and the sounds of torment, and then the smell hit me, a smell that has no equivalent on earth, an abomination to the senses. It smelled like burnt flesh and sulfur, yes, as the clichés say. But it was so much more. It smelled of stale fear, of sickness, of spiritual decay, and above all, it smelled of something infinitely worse, dead hope. The journey was over. I had arrived. I didn't need a sign. I knew, with a certainty that transcended any earthly knowledge, where I was. I was on the threshold of hell. The threshold of hell is not an iron gate with a sign. It is a transition of being. It is the point at which the last molecule of God's common grace, that mercy He pours out on the just and the unjust on earth, and the threshold of hell that allows laughter, love, and beauty, completely vanishes. The blackness of my fall began to give way to a light, but it was a light that wounded, an illumination without a source. Imagine the oppressive glare of a massive forest fire seen through thick, toxic smoke, a perpetual twilight the color of rust and despair. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. The sky, if it could be called that, was a vault of dead embers, flickering faintly with the memory of fire, but offering neither warmth nor hope. The air was thick, heavy, and every attempt to breathe in my spiritual form was like inhaling ground glass and ashes, and the smell I had perceived upon arrival now enveloped me, clung to my being. It was the stench of decay on a cosmic scale, sulfur, yes, but mingled with the metallic odor of endlessly spilled blood, the fetid smell of flesh that burns but is never consumed, and the unmistakable, sour aroma of panic that has become a permanent state. But the worst component of that atmosphere was not physical, it was spiritual. It was a blanket of despair so absolute, so heavy, that it crushed any thought that wasn't one of anguish. It was the palpable awareness of the total absence of God. On earth, even in the worst suffering, there exists an unconscious memory of light, an infinitesimal possibility of grace. Not there, the absence of God was a presence in itself, a void that was the source of all torment. The landscape stretching before me was God's creation in negative, a geography of agony, endless plains of what appeared to be cracked obsidian, from whose fissures not water gushed, but a dark, bubbling mud. Jagged, hostile mountains rose in the distance, like the broken teeth of a dead beast. Streams, but not of water, they were slow, viscous currents of something that looked like lava, that radiated a sensation of liquid pain. And everywhere, throughout this desolate panorama, there were souls. They were not the horned, trident-wielding demons of cartoons. What I saw was infinitely more tragic and terrifying. They were the naked essences of human beings, translucent, grayish figures writhing in a sea of misery. Although they were incredibly close to one another, crowds as far as the eye could see, each soul was utterly alone, encapsulated in its own bubble of torment. There was no community in suffering, no solace, only eternal isolation amidst a multitude of the damned. Their faces, or what remained of them, were frozen in masks of horror, of futile regret, of impotent fury directed at themselves, at others, and at the God they had rejected. And the sounds, the cacophony was maddening. High-pitched cries of physical pain mingled with the low, guttural moans of eternal remorse. The gnashing and grinding of teeth was not a metaphor, it was a real sound, the noise of endless frustration and rage, and above it all, like a hellish soundtrack, persisted that mocking laughter, the echo of the universe's derision of those who had mocked its creator. I was paralyzed by horror, a mere point of consciousness in this ocean of damnation. Then, a voice spoke. It didn't enter through my ears, for I had no ears. It was imprinted directly on my spirit with an authority and power that shook the very essence of my being. It wasn't a voice of comfort, it was the voice of pure and holy justice. Look. The simple command forced my attention. My perspective zoomed in like a camera's zoom across the plane of souls and focused on a particular scene unfolding on a rock platform that grotesquely resembled a stage. On that platform stood a soul. It was gesticulating, moving with frenetic energy, like a comedian in the middle of a routine. I couldn't hear its words, but I recognized the gestures, the cadence, the pause before the punchline. The soul was telling jokes. Below her, a mass of other souls watched, but their faces showed no joy. When the spectral comedian reached the climax of his joke, the audience did not laugh. Instead, they raised their tormented faces and let out a collective cry of accusation and pain, a sound that struck the soul of the stage and made it convulse in agony. Then, the laughter the comedian had provoked on earth resonated around him. But now it was a demonic laugh, a torture that mocked his pain. He was trapped in an eternal loop, forced to perform the same act that condemned him and receiving as payment the fruit of his labor, the pain of those he tripped up and the mockery that was now his torment. The voice spoke again in my spirit, cold and sharp as a diamond. This is the fate of the United States. The wit I gave it to mock the holy, it wanted to be the center of attention and craved laughter. Now she has both things. Eternity, he reaps the laughter he sowed. But the joy has been taken away, and only poison remains. My spiritual being shuddered, despite the distorted and tormented appearance of the soul on that stage. I recognized the style. It was a famous atheist comedian from a previous generation, a man whose work I had studied and admired, whose sharp irreverence had been my role model. I was seeing him. I was seeing the logical and terrible end of the path I had so proudly chosen. It was not an arbitrary punishment. It was the perfect and horrific harvest of his own sowing. In the pain-contorted face of that doomed comedian, I saw my own future. I saw the stage that awaited me, and for the first time in my arrogant life, in the total absence of God, I understood the meaning of the fear of God. It was not a fright, it was the absolute understanding that He is holy, that His justice is perfect, and that my entire life had been an affront to His majesty. The abstract horror had become personal, and the guided tour of the fruits of my labor had only just begun. The terror I felt seeing my idol, my spiritual mentor in cynicism, trapped in that infernal loop, was only the beginning. It was the selfish terror of one who sees their own sentence written on the wall. My spiritual being contracted, wanting to flee, wanting to deny the obvious connection between his fate and mine, but in that the terror I felt realm of absolute truth. Self-deception is impossible. Every fiber of my consciousness knew that I was on the same production line as damned souls, but the holy and terrible voice was not yet finished with me. My lesson had only just begun. As I stood paralyzed, watching the spectral comedian receive his pay, the voice resounded again, not with anger, but with the relentless clarity of a universal law. Sin does not die with the sinner, it creates ripples in eternity. Not only does the sower reap his reward, now, look at the harvest in the field that you and others like you have plowed with tongues of mockery. The scene of the comedian on his rock stage faded, not to my relief, but to be replaced by something infinitely worse. The perspective that the voice forced upon me expanded, and now I saw not one individual, but countless souls scattered across different regions of that nightmarish landscape, and in some horrifying, supernatural way, I knew these were not random souls. They were my audience. My gaze was drawn to a man. On earth, he would have been a scholar or an intellectual. I saw him trapped in a kind of endless library with shelves that disappeared into the gloom, but the books were blank. He ran frantically from one aisle to another searching for an answer, a truth, a single meaningful sentence. His torment was an unquenchable intellectual thirst in a desert of emptiness, and as he ran, demonic voices whispered in his ear, not with threats, but with the same nihilistic philosophies and atheistic arguments he had loved in life. They presented him with unsolvable paradoxes, self-devouring syllogisms, leading him to a state of perpetual confusion and madness. And on a wall of that library, like a hellish movie screen, my face was projected. He saw fragments of my comedy specials where I, with an arrogant smile, provided him with the evidence and witty lines he used to prop up his unbelief. He had used my jokes as a shield against the simple truth of the gospel. And now his beloved intellect was the camera of torture from which I could not escape. The voice explained to me without emotion. It loved the wisdom of men more than my truth. She rejected the one who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Now she has what she chose, a path that leads nowhere, a life that is death, and a search for truth in the kingdom of the father of lies. Before I could process that horror, my gaze was drawn to another soul, a woman. I could tell that on earth she had been a cultural Christian. She went to church at Christmas and Easter. She considered herself a good person, but her faith had no roots. Her torment was one of the cruelest I have ever witnessed. She stood on the edge of an unfathomable abyss, and on the other side, at a distance that seemed reachable but was infinite, she could see a warm and beautiful light. She could hear, far away, the echo of heavenly music, of pure joy. It was heaven, and she knew it. Her torment was standing eternally in view of all that she had lost, and all around her were little devils with my face and her voice was full of whispers in her ear of the jokes I had told about religious fanatics, about people who took the Bible too seriously. She had laughed. She had used my comedy to justify her lukewarmness, to feel comfortable in her superficial faith. Now each of those laughs was a brick in the wall that separated her from glory, and the memory of her own complacency was the fire that consumed her. I beg you, I implore you from the depths of my transformed soul, think about the power of your words, your likes, the memes you share. They may seem harmless, but they can be the little push someone needs to turn away from God. If this message is impacting you, if you are beginning to see the seriousness of this, please like and share it, not because of my channel, but because someone you know, a friend, a family member, could be on one of those paths laughing as they walk toward the abyss. Your action sharing could be the warning the Holy Spirit uses to awaken him. The most heartbreaking vision was of a young man. He couldn't have been more than 19 or 20 years old. I saw him in a cell, alone, but the cell walls weren't made of rock, they were made of mirrors, and in each mirror, he didn't see himself, but the faces of the people who had loved him on earth, his parents praying for him, a youth leader inviting him to a retreat, Christian friends offering him genuine community. He had rejected all of that. He had chosen the cynicism I peddled because it was cool, because it gave him a rebel identity. My voice came from the walls, repeating jokes about virginity, about prayer, about the weakness of needing God. His torment was utter loneliness, surrounded by the ghosts of every opportunity for love and fellowship he had scorned. With my voice as the soundtrack to his terrible choice, the weight of what I was seeing became unbearable. It wasn't just my soul that was at stake. The poison I had distilled had infected others. I felt a wave of guilt so immense that if I had had a physical body, I would have disintegrated. I tried to scream, to beg forgiveness from those souls, to tell them I was wrong, but in hell, there is no repentance worth anything, only remorse. The voice spoke one last time in this scene, and its words were a hammer on the anvil of my spirit, quoting the warning of my future Lord Jesus Christ. Their final decisions were theirs, but you provided the music for their march to perdition. Woe to the world for the stumbling blocks, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. At that moment, the torment of the comedian on his rock stage seemed like paradise compared to the horror I felt at becoming an eternal spectator of the hell I had helped create for others. The responsibility for their souls felt like a million anchors pulling me toward an abyss, even deeper. The weight of guilt for the souls I had helped condemn was a torment 1,000 times worse than any physical fire. It was a spiritual drowning. Every cry of accusation, every tormented face I had seen, became a stone bound to my being. sinking me into an abyss, the weight of guilt of despair within hell itself. I believed that was my final destiny, not only to burn, but to be eternally aware of the hell I had helped to populate. In that pit of self-awareness and endless remorse, I abandoned all hope. I was no longer Elias Laina, the successful comedian. I was a soul killer, and I was receiving my just pay in the currency of the kingdom of darkness, shared agony. It was at that precise moment, at the absolute nadir of my existence, that the atmosphere of hell changed. It wasn't a subtle change, it was a violent disruption of the reality of that place. Suddenly, the cacophony of screams, wailing, and mocking laughter began to falter, as if an infinitely more powerful sound were drowning them out. The oppressive darkness itself seemed to recede, to cower, and from a point that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a light began to shine. I have no human words to describe this light. It wasn't like the light of a lamp's sunbeam, it was a living light. It was so incredibly pure and holy that it made creation itself seem like a dirty eraser. It was a light that not only illuminated but also judged. Upon contact with this light, the tormented souls around me howled with a new kind of terror and tried to hide, to bury themselves in the cracked earth. But there was nowhere to run. The demons, those malevolent presences I had felt but not clearly seen, shrieked like wounded animals and dissipated like smoke before its advance. The light did not destroy hell, but it exposed it for what it was, a realm of filth and rebellion in the presence of absolute holiness. And at the center of that indescribable light, I saw a figure. My spiritual being prostrated itself instinctively, not by choice, but by an inevitable reaction to the power and majesty that emanated from it. It was not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus of the paintings. He was a warrior king, a high priest, an eternal judge. His robe was whiter than anything the human mind could conceive, and his eyes were like flames of fire, not a fire of destruction, but a fire that saw all, that penetrated every layer of my being, every lie, every excuse, every hidden sin I myself had forgotten. His face shone with the intensity of the sun at its zenith, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was not the whisper of a gentle preacher, but the roar of many waters, a sound so powerful it shook the very foundation of damnation. I knew who he was. I didn't need anyone to tell me. Every atom of my consciousness screamed his name, Jesus, the same Jesus I had mocked, the same Jesus whose miracles I had ridiculed, the same Jesus whose resurrection I had called the greatest joke ever. I was there in the domain of his enemy, not as a prisoner, but as the sovereign king of all creation, visible and invisible. And then those fiery eyes fell upon me. I was the sole focus of his attention. In that gaze, my entire life flashed before me, not as a memory, but as a present reality. I saw every blasphemous joke I told, but this time I saw the pain it caused in God's heart. I saw every person who strayed from the faith because of me and felt a fraction of the sorrow he felt for his lost sheep. I saw my arrogance, my selfishness, my love of money and fame, not as traits of my personality, but as what they truly were, acts of betrayal against my Creator, who had formed me in my mother's womb and given me the gift of wit, which I had prostituted. Faced with this total exposure, I felt naked, filthy, a worm before the majesty of the universe. I expected a word of condemnation, a gesture that would cast me into the lake of fire that I now knew was terrifyingly real, but instead, his voice, like the roar of an ocean, spoke personally and directly to my spirit, and he didn't ask me about my sins. He asked me a much deeper question, a question that utterly shattered me. Elijah, why are you persecuting me? The question pierced me like a two-edged sword. I understood in an instant what the Apostle Paul must have felt on the road to Damascus. My jokes weren't against an idea, my mockery wasn't against religion, my attacks weren't against pastors or believers. They were against him, personally. Every laugh at the expense of the sacred was a spit in his face. Every soul I encouraged to doubt was another thorn in his crown. At that moment, revelation struck me with the force of a tsunami. Justice and love were,